Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt, joined by United States Senator Tom Cotton from the great state of Arkansas. Good morning, Senator Cotton. How are you?
Good morning, Hugh. It's good to be on with you. Happy Valentine's Day to all your listeners. Hope they have a special Valentine. You are extra special lucky that the Fetching Mrs. Hewitt allowed you to be a Valentine of all people.
I am greatly blessed, as are you, by your spouse. Senator, you're on Judiciary, so I want to ask you about the Federal Bureau of Investigation. There is this memo from Richmond that called out radical traditional Catholics as an extremist threat based on the Southern Poverty Law Center. Somehow, the agent or the intelligence analyst didn't know that the SPLC has no credibility. The supervisor didn't know. The head of the field office didn't know. It got up to D.C. and they didn't know. And until it became public, nobody revoked it. How does anyone not know that the SPLC is not credible?
It's mystifying to me, Hugh. You know, I've been explaining for years that the Southern Poverty Law Center is not just a left-wing front organization. It has its own deeply troubled history of racist and sexist activities in its own organization. So no one in the government should be under any illusions of what the Southern Poverty Law Center is. But Hugh, even if you didn't know anything about that left-wing group, you should have known from the very first moment you put eyes on this memo, inappropriate for the FBI out of the Richmond field office or anywhere else to be characterizing Catholics who choose to attend a traditional Latin-based Mass in this way. Not only on the Judiciary Committee, but on the Intelligence Committee. I've seen so many of our intelligence officers, especially doing the analysis, lose their way in recent years, focusing on Americans, on people who attend Catholic Mass or go to school board meetings, or for that matter, focusing on allies overseas who are pursuing political agendas they don't like. In no way is any of this foreign intelligence or related to our national security. Maybe they should be spending more time trying to figure out what we're shooting out of the skies over North America, or what China is up to in terms of trying to invade Taiwan at some point in the future, as opposed to focusing on Catholics who like to attend a Latin Mass.
Yeah, Senator, first impressions last. My first impression of the FBI goes back to 1984 at the Department of Justice, when they were hardcore on the hunt for the Soviets, the East Germans, and the Cubans in the United States, and they were doing great work. And I think Christopher Wray is a fine man with a distinguished record, but it's an agency with 38,000 employees, 14,000 of whom are special agents. And I don't know how to fix it, because this is not what they should be doing, especially when we have CCP agents overrunning the country at universities, stealing our secrets. And instead, we've got one of those 38,000 relying on the Southern Poverty Law Center to divert resources to investigate, admittedly very conservative Catholics who don't like Vatican II. But how do you fix that?
Well, Hugh, I can say that I'm confident the FBI has several thousand Catholics in it. Probably more than a few of those want to go to Catholic Mass as well. So we shouldn't paint with a broad brush about the FBI. But what Christopher Wray needs to do, what he should have been doing from the very beginning, is focusing on cleaning out the officers and agents in the FBI who've been captured by politics or ideology or bias. We should not have a Democratic FBI or a Republican FBI. We should have an FBI that focuses on genuine threats to our national security or to public safety from criminals. They should not be a partisan enforcement wing of either party. And fortunately, I don't think Director Wray has made that enough of a priority, especially in the last 2 years since the Biden crew took over. So he'll be in front of our committee later this spring, and I think he's going to get a lot of uncomfortable questions about why this kind of thing continues to happen inside of the Bureau. Not everyone should be accountable for the actions of a few wrong-headed agents and officers, but those agents and officers need to be held accountable.
Do you have, I'm going to lead up to a proposal about how one remedies this, but the Antifa movement continues to terrorize cities, and it continues to pop up. And then we continue to have mass shootings, as happened at Michigan State last night. How does an agency grapple with the former, the real threat, but not go down rabbit holes like radical traditionalist Catholics?
Hugh, I think a lot of that comes back to leadership from the top and down out to the field. And you have to have people from Chris Wray on out to your special agents focus on what their agents are doing. I remember something Bob Gates talked about in being Secretary of Defense and that mammoth department. You don't have to micromanage, but you need micro knowledge. You need to understand what your officers and agents are doing down to the field level and make it clear that we're focused on things like Antifa street militias or Al-Qaeda and ISIS or Russian and Chinese spies in our country, that we're not focused on parents going to school boards or Catholics going to a Latin mass, even if you politically disapprove of those people.
So your friend, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, wrote in his memoir, Never Give an Inch, about the difficulty of getting the Department of State to do anything that they don't want to do, because it's a deeply, deeply politicized left-wing agency. Not the same at the CIA, by the way. He says they are fairly easily given. I think the only answer is to roll back civil service protections, which actually means you can't discipline or fire anyone for any reason, including stupidity, without Merit System Protection Board hearings, an endless process that divert time, energy, and mission. Therefore, the tendency of managers is simply to try and isolate the problem, not remove it. Is there a rewrite needed in the federal unionization and the federal protection of employees, Senator?
Well, so Hugh, first off, let me make a point about what Mike Pompeo wrote in his book, contrasting the CIA and his management there versus the State Department. Remember, those rules don't apply to the CIA. It's not just that the CIA attracts a different kind of person who has different priorities and wants to pursue a different kind of job. It's that the CIA director is not bound by those civil service protection rules. Bob Gates jokes, because, he was the CIA director for his Secretary of Defense, that the happiest moment he had when he took over the job of director of the CIA was when he got briefed by HR and explained that he could basically do whatever he wanted with any employee, irrespective of civil service rules.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, that's not the case when you're Secretary of Defense or when you're Secretary of State. So I do think that we need a substantial overhaul of civil service rules. We have way too many career bureaucrats at senior policymaking levels who are thwarting the plans and the policies of the elected leaders of our government. I know that President Trump at the end of his tenure was proposing a sweeping rewrite of the civil service rules to try to bring more political accountability into these departments and agencies to ensure that the people making policies, if they haven't been elected by our people, have been directly appointed and are accountable to persons who are elected.
The only major law that President Carter passed was the 1978 Civil Service Reform Act, which established, among other things, the Merit Systems Protection Board. And I had to deal with that at OPM when I was running OPM in the late 80s. It's a nightmare. You can't. So exempting agencies from that would be a wonderful thing, especially the Bureau is the CIA for domestic purposes, and DOD civilians should be subject to the same disciplines of the military. And when you were in the military, if you screwed up, what happened, Senator?
Well, I mean, yeah, you got whether it's a Article 15, as we call it in the Army, or Captain's Mast in the Navy, or other kind of military discipline, you got punished severely and swiftly. And that's how you maintain good order and discipline. That's part of the problem with the civilian ranks in the Department of Defense or throughout the government, that they have all this legal rigmarole and process in place to allow them to get away with anything. The stories are legion about, the bureaucrat who was watching online pornography at a government cubicle and couldn't even be disciplined for that. Or people who have, wasted taxpayer dollars on boondoggle trips all around the country, and they haven't been disciplined or effectively disciplined, I should say. So we need a substantial rewrite of these rules. And I would say, Hugh, not just in the FBI or the Department of Defense, all across the government. We shouldn't have unelected bureaucrats at the Department of Commerce or other departments making policy for the American people. They are at most supposed to implement the policy of the President of the United States, who's accountable to the people, and the Congress, who writes the rules for our country.
Senator, you are a graduate of Harvard Law. You know your constitutional law. You know your importance of procedural protections for people. So I know you are informed by the ability to protect people from malign and stupid bosses. But when there is a DEI department in any state agency, I think it is a prima facie case of unconstitutionality, because by definition, diversity, equity, and inclusion is going to touch on race. And I believe it is almost certainly unconstitutional for people to use any racial tool in the government. What do you think about DEI in the state setting?
Well, I agree with you, Hugh. It's almost on its face a constitutional violation. I hope the Supreme Court rules later this year in the context of admissions to higher education that you cannot have racial discrimination, no matter which race you're favoring and disfavoring. That, of course, extends to things like government employment or government policies. I think a new Republican president and cabinet needs to carefully scrub every inch of their departments and agencies to remove these people. I have legislation right now that would cap the salary that DEI consultants are getting in our military at what an E5 sergeant team leader would get. We shouldn't be paying people taking on the hardest and riskiest job in our military less than what we're paying PhDs in so-called diversity studies. But unfortunately, they're getting hundreds of thousands of dollars when sergeants are getting, just tens of thousands of dollars.
Last question, Senator. Is this a bipartisan issue about reforming the FBI and the rest of the bureaucracies where our national security is involved? Can you find colleagues across the aisle who realize this isn't Republican, Democrat? We just have to make these things work and not be run by the least common denominator.
Hugh, I wish it were, but I can't really say that it is, unfortunately. It's kind of like the issue with big tech. Republicans and Democrats seem to agree that big tech is out of control. Republicans think rightly that big tech censors conservative voices. Democrats complain that it doesn't censor conservatives enough. So again, I think the Democrats, especially in the Congress, think that the FBI and our intelligence communities aren't doing enough to harass parents attending school boards to stop left-wing indoctrination of their kids. Or the FBI isn't doing enough to stop these radical traditional Catholics who have the audacity to doubt or dispute decisions of the Catholic hierarchy or go to Latin Mass. It's like, the so-called disinformation and misinformation, which really is just information that is inconvenient to Joe Biden and the Democratic Party. So I wish I could say that it was a bipartisan issue. Maybe you can get bipartisan agreement on the problem, but so far I haven't seen bipartisan agreement on the solution.
Well, when the supermajority finally arrives, I hope you guys repeal Jimmy Carter's only legislative achievement and get back to competence. Senator Tom Cotton, always a pleasure. Thank you, Senator. Come right back to the Hugh Hewitt Show.